Słuchajcie, rozdajemy wam Jordan Mechner's 20 Tips on Making Games. Rozdamy wam chyba wszystkim, może nam się uda. To jest specjalny request naszego gościa. Także macie gratisy od nas. Jordan już nadciąga. Znacie gościa, nie? Zrobił Prince of Persia chyba, z tego co kojarzę. Another World, Prince of Persia. Dobry ten Pixel Heaven w 2022. Co, Miczu? Dlaczego nie ma braw? Przepraszam bardzo, przecież to... Facet dał wam Prince of Persia. That's all what I wanted. Just a little applause, please.
Hi, thank you for that welcome. I'm really happy to be here. So Piotr and I are just gonna chat. We've been talking about games and other things for the last couple of days, so now we're just going to continue the conversation with you all. And we've got this clipboard that we're going to pass around. If anybody wants to get news and more information about the things we're talking about, you can enter your email address, and then you'll get my monthly newsletter in your inbox. So anybody who wants to just could put your name here. And now I'll let Piotr do what he does best.
My first question would be about your family roots, because as we, maybe not all, but most of us know that your father was famous psychologist. He was born in Vienna in the beginning of 30s, but the roots of your family are in Poland, as we spoke yesterday and today. The name Bielic, which is Bielsko-Biała, was in the works. Can you say more about your family roots in Poland?
I'm happy to. Yes, my grandfather's father was born there, as we were talking about today, and he then emigrated to Vienna, where my father was born. So I was born in New York, where my father and grandfather and family emigrated to in the 1930s. Oh, that was the short story. I could talk for an hour about my family. It's maybe one thing that will be interesting for everyone here to know is that my dad, although he was a psychologist, he was also a very passionate musician and classical pianist. So I grew up hearing him play the piano, and so when I started programming computer games as a teenager, it was actually my dad who had the idea to add music to the game to make it more dramatic. And this was the Apple II, which didn't have very much musical capacity, but my dad composed on the piano the music for Karateka and Prince of Persia, and then figured out how to approximate that on the Apple II, and then later on the Amiga and PC versions. So I was very happy to work with my dad as the composer for my first two games.
Let's go back to the beginning of 80s. There is gold era of video games. All the video games, Polaros, arcades are at the top. You are a teenager at the time. What was your recollections from that time? You were an avid player playing in arcades. What were your favorite titles?
Yeah, well, the first games that I really got addicted by were Space Invaders, and then after that, sort of the first golden age of arcade games happened. But I was already a teenager then. As a kid growing up, there were no video games. There was pinball. I played pinball at the local pizza parlor and bowling alley, like everyone else. But it wasn't especially a passion. Then the first video games were Tank War, and again, it was, fun to drop a quarter in, but you wouldn't do it very often. It was like pinball was actually a deeper and more interesting game than those first simple video arcade games. But then Space Invaders was something else. I really got addicted, and about this time, I discovered the personal computer. A friend of mine had an Apple II. This was 1978, and that was. I was just amazed that he could have a computer in his house and he could program it whenever he wanted because the only computers I had seen until then were and I was very lucky that I grew up close to New York, and IBM had a program where they let high school students come to their campus and use their computers. So, at age 13, 14, I was already starting to learn programming from older kids, and but it was something that I got to do like once a week for a couple of hours on a Thursday night. So for my friend to have a computer at home that he could use all the time was like a dream. So I started saving up to buy my own Apple II computer. And there was a version of Space Invaders, Apple Invaders on cassette, which was unlike any Apple game I'd seen because they were all low-res graphics. There was Breakout, programmed by Woz himself, and other very simple games. But somehow Space Invaders, or Apple Invaders as it was called, was exactly like the arcade game. It had it was high-res graphics. It was programmed in assembly language. It was so that sort of set the bar. And from 1978 to 1980, 81, when I was in high school, that was kind of my ambition, was to program an arcade game knockoff that would be as accurate as Apple Invaders had been to Space Invaders. And the game that I set out to copy was Asteroids, which was my new addiction. And I guess that was 1980, 81. It was a little trickier because Asteroids was vector graphics and the Apple II was not. But nonetheless, I spent my senior year of high school really trying to do a faithful copy of Asteroids.
But in 1982, you started to write a journal. It was also the moment that you decided to go to video games industry. And what was the spark that started you to decide that you want to make computer games? You remember the moment that you realized that you want to be a game creator?
I think it wasn't one moment, but I think since I was a little kid, like since age, when I was 5 or 6, what I wanted to do with my pencils and crayons was make comic books that were like the comics, that I saw from Disney and, others. And then, as pretty much every time I got excited about something, I wanted to, I had the ambition to make it, but because I was a kid, it wasn't really possible. I wanted to be an animator. At age 11, 12, I was trying to make my own animated movies, but it took me like a whole day just to draw one cell. And then the next day I would do the second cell, and I realized at 24 frames a second, I would be old, before I could make an entire movie. So that wasn't possible. But when the computer came along, I realized that, and I think what attracted me about programming was that this was something that I could actually do. It was beyond my ability to make a feature film, as a teenager, but with this computer, I could make games that were, and I could imagine that within a few years, if I really worked hard at it, I might be able to make games that were as good as the games that I was seeing in the computer stores, and then seeing Apple Invaders, and then games of other early programmers like Bill Budge and Nasir, who were doing things that were beyond my ability, but it's like, maybe I could figure out how to do that, and I could make games that were as good as the arcade games. So I think it was that, it wasn't that I loved games more than movies, or other art forms, but this one seemed like it was almost within my reach, and that was, and the results that I could get by programming, I could work on something for a weekend, and then by the end of the weekend, I could get it to work. That was very, to have that possibility of control and mastery, when you're a kid and there's very little in your world that you can actually master, that sort of, that sucked me in. And, at a certain point, starting in age, it was in high school, I would say, that I really, that my main project, my main dream became, to make a computer game that would be good enough to get published. And that, and I took that with me even when I started college or university. We called it college in the U.S. Alongside whatever I was studying, I still had my Apple computer in my dorm room, and that's what I was really spending all my time on, more than my classes. And as you can see in the journal that I started to keep in 1982, when I was 17, I was already really focused on trying to make and sell my first game, which starting with that Asteroids knockoff, but then that's another story.
You mentioned about Bill Batch. This was a guy working for Electronic Arts, and there was a famous advertisement saying that Bill Batch is preparing the game that will make you cry. So it was probably he was the biggest idol of the young programmers at the moment, at the very early 80s.
Yeah, Bill Budge was, he was really, I'm going to take off my jacket because it's warm. Will you hold this for a sec?
Yep.
Yeah, Bill Budge was, I mean, a legend to me because he was so far advanced, technically beyond what other programmers were doing. His, I mean, there was Raster Blaster, which was a pinball game, and then his Space album used 3D raster graphics, which were, you know, that required a kind of mathematical calculation that was far beyond me. And then, of course, Electronic Arts and Broderbund were sort of the two big games companies in the US around that time.
Your first main project was, of course, Karateka, which has been published in 1984. As somebody who took autograph from you mentioned that it was very shocking, smooth animation in this game. And also you put very big objects to this game. For example, the bird that was attacking you at the end of the game, the smooth animation of it and the way that it moved was so shocking. Maybe only Epics in Impossible Mission at the time used such advanced technique, but you made it alone. And tell us about the process of making Karateka at the time.
So the idea of having large figures fighting each other was something I'd seen in a game called Swashbuckler. It was sword fighting, but although the frames were large, it was very, you know, it was just alternating poses. There wasn't real animation. So I wanted to do animation, but when I tried, it just came out looking wrong, looking sort of choppy and jerky, and I was very disappointed by the results. And I felt like it was the timing that was wrong. So my dad, again, had the idea of saying, "Why don't you film somebody doing the moves, and then you can look at the footage and see what they actually did." And so I did that. I filmed my mom's karate teacher doing the punching and kicking and all the different moves I would need for the game. This was 1982, so I had to use Super 8 film. Got the film developed and you know, put it on a movie editor, a Moviola, and looked at it frame by frame, and realized that more than just looking at the frames, it would make sense to actually trace the outlines of the frames, and because then the proportions would be correct as well. So I put sheets of tracing paper on the screen of the Moviola, and with a pencil traced the silhouette of not every frame, every third frame. So it was gave me a frame rate of 8 frames per second. And then I used a device called the VersaWriter, which is too arcane to get into. It lasted, it was an early Apple peripheral that lasted for about 5 minutes. And it's possible that Roberta Williams and I were the only 2 people to buy one. But it let me trace the outlines of the characters and get them onto the Apple screen in a way that I could then kind of move the pixels around and edit them. And so it was a very laborious process, but when I got that character up on the screen, it was so much more lifelike than anything that I had been able to draw on my own. I just realized that was the way. I mean, you could say it was it wasn't really a sophisticated technology. It was really just the kind of the decision to copy from nature instead of to try to imagine, you know, or invent in my imagination what those things would be. And that was rotoscoping, and that's a technique that I came back to again a few years later for my next game, Prince of Persia, and then years later after that for The Last Express. And you know, I still use it to this day. I really think that the basis of you know, of creating something new, it's best to go as close to the source as you can. And if you're animating, you know, a human or an animal, you know, you should look at what that really is in nature. If you're drawing a tree, you know, you should go into a forest and look at trees. You know, you can Google trees or forest and you can look at photographs or paintings of a tree that someone else made, but you get something else when you go to the original, and that was certainly That was certainly true for, I mean, as primitive as the animation was for karateka, you know, at the time, just using a model from life was something that hadn't been done yet in computer games, and I think that was really, that was the magic, you know, of that technique at that time.
When you started to search for a publisher, you knocked to the door of Brotherbound. Tell us why Brotherbound, not, for example, Electronic Arts, for which Bill Budge worked, or I don't know, Datasoft. Why you decided to choose them, and what was your recollection of the Carlstons?
Well, at this time, I was a teenager in New York. You know, all those other companies were in California, so I had never met any of the people involved. And the whole idea of a computer games industry was kind of theoretical to me. Like, I subscribed to a magazine called Soft Talk, which I guess, as you've told me that in Poland, magazines were and are very important. And they certainly were, for me then, printed magazines that I subscribed to that came into the mailbox once a month were my only source of information, really, about how these games that I was so interested in were getting made. And I had seen a profile of Broderbund Software. You know, it was founded by 3 siblings, Doug, Gary, and Kathy Carlston. And the writer of the article obviously really liked them, thought they were, you know, good, very sincere, trustworthy people, and that Broderbund had a great culture. And of course, Broderbund had also published some of my favorite games at the time. There was Apple Galaxian, Lode Runner came out in, I think, '82. And then Electronic Arts was more visible. They had those wonderful ads you mentioned where they identified their programmers. They kind of had their pitch was that games are an art form, and we're the publisher that recognizes this. And they had also published some of the best games. So I actually submitted karateka to both Broderbund and Electronic Arts on a floppy disk. I mailed the disk to both of them with a letter explaining who I was and hoping that they would consider it. And Electronic Arts never answered me, but Broderbund did. And I ended up, this was my second to last year of college. I ended up taking the summer and going out to spend that summer at Broderbund to finish making the game. And as I wrote in my journals at the time, I wrote like with great excitement about meeting all of these people, like Dan Gorlin, the creator of Choplifter, Doug Smith, who'd made Lode Runner, and the Carlstons, and this 1984 was my real first encounter with the software industry and meeting the people that had just been names on a screen to me up till then. And finished karateka over the summer, and it was published in the fall. I later found out, Doug Carlston told me that when they had shown karateka at, I think it was CES, that Trip Hawkins from Electronic Arts had stopped by the Broderbund booth, seen karateka, and gotten very excited. Oh, why didn't somebody offer this game to us? We would have loved to publish this. But apparently, the submissions process in 1982 was a lot more casual, and I just sent in an envelope. It was on a floppy disk between pieces of cardboard. It just ended up at a pile, and I don't think anybody at Electronic Arts ever saw it. That's that story.
Mm-hmm. But when you take a look at karateka, there are mountains in the distant background. And when I saw it, I think it was your dream to create more intricate, more complex, more realistic environments. And few years passed, I think five years passed, and you had a chance to move this unnamed hero from karateka to completely another labyrinth and completely other more complex environments. It was, of course, Prince of Persia. Also, your father created for the second time the music for this game. Tell us about the beginning of the process to create Prince of Persia and how the production looked like.
So I had the real good luck that karateka was successful. So as graduating from college, I was in the very unusual position of not needing to get a job right away because I was getting royalties from the game, so I could really stop and think about what I wanted to do next. And I thought I wanted to make another game, and Broderbrand was eager to do a Karateka 2. But the games that I was most excited by at that time were Lode Runner and something called The Castles of Dr. Creep. Does anybody here remember that one? It was only on the Commodore 64, programmed by Ed Hobbs, but it had these puzzles where you would step on you'd pull a lever and open a gate, and you kind of had to figure it out logically. And then I had seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, which came out in 1981, and like most people of my generation, I was really just delighted and blown away by the energy and the action of especially the opening sequence where Indiana Jones runs through the temple, and there's a gate that's closing, and he has to pull himself up and dive through it, and then he reaches back and grabs his hat. I thought, looking at a platform game like Lode Runner or Castles of Dr. Creep, I felt like somehow that was the same action as the Indiana Jones sequence, but so wouldn't it be great to do a platform game like that with puzzles, but where the character was animated, and so that there was actually a suspense of like speed, and that if you fell on spikes, it would hurt. That that the film Indiana Jones conveyed that games at that time usually didn't. It was more in Lode Runner, when you fell, you sort of floated down, and so it was kind of an abstract representation of running and jumping. But I thought, what if I used the rotoscoping technique of Karateka to do real running and jumping that felt visceral, that felt that if you fell too far, it would hurt. So that was the basic idea. And then, and Broderbrand was less convinced about that because it was what we would today call a new IP. It was unproven. It wasn't a sequel to Karateka, which had done very well. So their attitude was kind of, well, let's wait and see what this becomes. And as I wrote in my journals, I moved from New York to California kind of on faith, that this could work out. And so for a couple of years, Broderbrand was a growing company at that time, and they were actually moving away from games and getting more into productivity software like the print shop. So by 1987, 88, I was kind of one of the few sort of almost like a holdover of the previous generation at Broderbrand. I didn't have a job. I wasn't a Broderbrand employee. I wasn't really part of any project or team. I was just off in a corner doing my own thing. And but Doug was kind enough to let me keep my desk and just let me keep doing it. And as my journals explain, in day by day, there were ups and downs. There were periods when I kind of thought maybe I would give up this project, that it wasn't really worth it. Then there were times when I got excited about it again and said, no, I'm going to see this through. And it took 4 years, but Prince of Persia came out of that.
Prince of Persia, I think, was initial success almost from the start. And
I'll stop you there because it was actually not a success when it shipped on the Apple II. One big reason was that the Apple II in 1989, the end of 1989, when Prince of Persia finally shipped, was a dying platform. More than dying, it was almost dead. And the big software chains like Electronics Boutique, many of them actually didn't even take Prince of Persia because it was on the wrong platform. The Apple II sections in their stores were getting smaller, so they just wanted to sell off their existing stock. They didn't want new titles. So I was really frustrated that that Christmas of 1989, this game that I'd been working on for almost 4 years, which I really put everything I had into it. I thought it was just the best game I could possibly make on the Apple II. And I walked into my neighborhood stores, and they didn't even carry it, but they had Karateka. But Prince of Persia, it was almost like it hadn't launched. So we put all of our hopes into the PC version. There was a Broderbrand team, a great programmer, Lance Grudy, and a little team of artists, and there was a sound designer, Tom Reddick. My dad recomposed the music. His original score that he had played on a Steinway, which I had done my best to translate to the Apple II, the speaker that could play values from 0 to 255. The PC could do real music on a, it had MIDI cards. There were all different graphics cards. So we really, for the PC version, made the best version of Prince of Persia possible. And I worked closely with the Broderbund team. We cleaned up all the sprites, redid a lot. We added the digitized sounds of the chomping blades and the springing spikes, which are probably what most of you remember, since I can't imagine there are many people in this room who ever played the Apple II version. Maybe a few. So the game shipped in early 1990 on the PC, and it was a flop too. Yeah, it's and again, this was agonizing for me and for the product manager at Broderbund, and the whole team had worked so hard, and we really believed in this game. But all the stores, again, the big chains, saw this as a port. They looked at the numbers for the Apple version of Prince of Persia, saw that it had sold nothing, maybe a few hundred copies total, and they said, well, why should we publish a port of a game that didn't do well the first time? And the marketing department at Broderbund kind of had the same feeling, even though Broderbund by then, it wasn't a huge company by modern standards, but it was big enough that there was a marketing department that kind of made the decisions of what products to prioritize. And really the big picture was Broderbund was not a games company. Games had not sold well for a long time. And they kind of saw Prince of Persia as just this odd thing that didn't fit into their strategy. So again, it seemed like Prince of Persia was going to be a critical success that a few people who discovered it would be passionate about, but that most players, would never find out it existed. And that was the case for the first year, really the first year and a half after Prince of Persia shipped, which it's hard to imagine today that a game would ship, that it would be a flop for a year and a half, and then somehow turn it around. I mean, maybe there are stories like that, but we pretty much assume now that your launch is the best and only shot you're ever going to get, and that if it's not a success in the first few weeks, let alone the first year, you might be in trouble. But the two things that saved Prince of Persia not even in 1990, but starting in 1991 and 92, Broderbund had licensed out the rights to Prince of Persia on different platforms in different territories. So versions started to appear in Japan, in Europe, on machines like the Sega Genesis, the NEC, and platforms that I had never seen in countries that I'd never visited, by teams that I had never met, produced versions of Prince of Persia that suddenly did very well because the console markets were expanding during this time, and Prince of Persia arrived on these formats with no preconceptions. And so we started hearing, wow, it's a huge success in Japan. It's a success in England. It's doing really well here. And then the other big thing is the Mac version. The Mac port finally got finished, and this was something that originally had been supposed to be done almost immediately. And the team of programmers and artists that was doing the Mac version, somehow, because the programmer was a real perfectionist, he fell behind schedule, and what was supposed to take 6 months took a year, and then another 6 months, and then another year. Again, something that today, who would let that happen? But the Mac version shipped over 2 years late. But what had happened in those 2 years was that Apple, as we just saw in the Apple Museum downtown, is Apple had released new Macs that had color screens, bigger screens, and the Mac had kind of become the desktop publishing machine of choice. So journalists, people who worked at magazines in the US now had Macs. So even though it was only 5% of the games market, and games publishers didn't really think of the Mac as a machine to develop games for, when we released Prince of Persia on the Mac, and this was in 1992, journalists were able to play this game. People who had a Mac at work, that was their work machine, said, wow, here's a game that's cool, it's in color, it's got animation, it's got sound, I can play it, and I can enjoy it with my friends and family. And so it was, again, from being on the wrong platform at the wrong time, suddenly Prince of Persia was in the right platform at the right time. And the Mac version took off. Again, helped very much by the fact that in the US, Broderbund repackaged it in an oddly shaped trapezoidal box designed by Hakio in San Francisco. And this was, again, I have to thank Doug Carlston for this because he allowed my product manager, Brian, to convince him to re-release the PC version that had been a flop in the new box, which, again, marketing departments usually don't do. Oh, this game was a flop. We lost money, so why should we spend more money on it? But they did, and the re-released version of Prince of Persia on the PC and Mac suddenly took off, and that's when Prince of Persia became a hit in 1992.
So I correct my question, not initial success, but success after 2 years made Brother bound to make you, I don't know, another propositions, some kind of carte blanche, you were became the golden boy for another project, or just one of the many?
Well, yes and no. So in we did the sequel to Prince of Persia 2, and that was a kind of a collaboration. I was half in, but not. It wasn't like the all-consuming thing that Prince of Persia 1 had been for me, because from being the programmer and the animator and everything on Prince of Persia 2, I said, I'll design the game, but I'll trust the team at Broderbund to execute it. And I actually spent those 2 years traveling, writing screenplay, making a short film. I made a documentary in Cuba, and it was really a personal question for me at that time. Like, I really felt like I needed some balance in my life, and that by spending most of the 10 years from age 15 to 25 in front of an Apple II computer, I was also missing out on a lot. And so I wanted to travel and live in other countries, do other things. And so Prince of Persia 2 was a way for me to do that, but still manage the project and still visit the team in San Francisco every maybe once every 2 months. And I also was able to design the levels using a level editor and sending floppy disks back and forth between Paris and San Francisco, but in Federal Express and DHL envelopes. So that was Prince 2, which was also a success. So after that, yeah, I mean, you could say that Broderbund was eager to do another project, but they didn't want to do Prince of Persia 3 because the industry had just gone from 2D to 3D in that time. Doom had come out, changed everything. And so in 1993, Broderbund, they actually passed on Prince of Persia 3. I had imagined it as a trilogy, but that third version never, it just wasn't the kind of game that was selling at the time. There was no retro, nostalgic 2D games market at the time. Everybody wanted, real-time 3D or fully rendered 3D. And Myst came out about that time, and that was one of the first games that had photorealistic 3D rendered backgrounds, which amazed everybody, including me. To have gone in a few years from the 280 by 192 pixel Apple II screen, where the pixels could only be one of 2 different colors depending on whether they were odd or even. To go from that to the graphics of Myst was just an incredible advance. And CGI was starting to be used in movies now for the first time. Movies had been using film and analog technology up until then, but Lucasfilm was just down the road from Broderbund, and they were starting to use computer graphics in their movies. So at about this point, I put together a team in San Francisco to make The Last Express, which was a kind of a combination of 2 different technologies, because the game took place on the Orient Express in 1914, so it involved recreating the train, the interior and exterior of the train in 3D, in using the sort of Myst-style 3D modeling and rendering for a point-and-click adventure game. And it also involved historical research, which is something that I loved and still do love. But then the characters were rotoscoped. We filmed actors in period costumes against a blue screen and used a special a special tool that we had developed to rotoscope these images and kind of turn them into something resembling pen and ink drawings, like inspired by the Art Nouveau art of the period, of the turn of the century period when The Last Express was set. So you had these kind of cartoon, flatly colored characters, but very lifelike and very expressive, moving in a very human way against a 3D rendered background. And that was the look of The Last Express.
You jump through two next titles, Prince of Persia 2 and Last Express, but I wanted to ask you about this transitional moment in Prince of Persia 2, because you were the creator of original concept for this game, but the main programmer was a guy called, I think, Lance Grudy, the guy from Brotherhood who also made Myst, was not main author, but was working at Myst and Carmen Sandiego, for example. Yeah. And it was very interesting, fascinating thing that you deliberately made a step back because you took the main decisions to Lance Grudy at this project. And what were you thinking about the future? What you're gonna do? Because Bill Batch, for example, and Dan Banton were almost out of the business. So these great creators from the past were moving out from the scene, and you were on the career. Your career was rising, and you could be main star of the industry at the moment. But you decided to make a step back.
Lance Grudy was the programmer of the PC version of Prince 1, and and Lance, I think he, if I remember right, I think he had been promoted and he was now in charge of the whole programming department at Broderbund, and Jeff Charvat did the programming on Prince 2. But yeah, I mean, it was a step back in the sense that I didn't see creating a game as a one-man show necessarily. But programming for me was never the goal. It was more a means to an end. I mean, I mentioned that when I first discovered programming as a teenager, before then my passion had been drawing and writing, and I wanted to be a cartoonist or make animated movies, or maybe, and then in college to write screenplays of live action films. So I saw games as a storytelling medium, like film, like TV, like animation. But the reasons why games had appealed to me, as a 15-year-old, it was one of the few avenues available to me. After Prince of Persia, I had choices, and I thought I was more interested in kind of the overall, creation of a project rather than just the programming component, in itself. And I wasn't just interested in games. I still wanted to make films. I still wanted to do books. And above all, as I mentioned, I wanted to travel and experience more of the world. I didn't want to put it this way. I was 25. I'd spent most of the last 10 years in, programming my computer. I didn't want to wake up at age 35 and find out that I'd spent, the past 20 years in an industrial park, and I had never had time to do anything else. So I think I was kind of searching for myself as well, traveling, making documentary films, and just going to a country where I didn't speak the language, where I had to integrate into a new culture, meeting different kinds of people. All of that had that was just something I needed to do at the time. And as far as making Prince of Persia 2, I was pretty satisfied with the way it turned out. I would say that the compromise was that the game was, it didn't, I didn't set out to do something incredibly innovative that would blow everybody away, that was not what you would expect from a Prince of Persia sequel. I mean, it was really exactly what you would expect from a Prince of Persia sequel, but with better graphics, with more levels, with better production values. It was a game that Broderbund could understand. When I pitched it, they were like, yes, this we can do, because that's, in general, that's what publishers are good at and were good at then, is to build upon an existing success and just do it better, add more features, do it a little bigger, and that's what Prince of Persia 2 was.
Let's talk a while about The Last Express. It was many perceive it as your opus magnum as a game. There are many characters. The story develops almost in real time. The characters are living their own lives. So I think you are not the only one who was producing this game. Tell us about the team that you were leading at the time, and what was the reception of Last Express just after release?
Yeah, so Last Express was it was the opposite to the mindset that I just described. This was after I had just spent a few years traveling, and and I discovered European comic books, French bande dessinée, and was really inspired by those. I had lived in France, learned French. I was interested in European history. So to do The Last Express, which was a historically accurate adventure story set in the last days before World War I, was a very personally meaningful project for me. And here I really wanted to do something that had never been done before in that way. To do a point-and-click adventure game that would also be immersive, but where you wouldn't feel that the characters were just sort of sitting around in a room waiting for you to show up and click on them so that they could do something. As a player, I dreamed of having a game where I could move around and feel like I was just kind of, like a mystery house kind of thing, where I was, the kind of place where you buy a ticket and you go in with a bunch of other people and you walk around a house and there are actors playing out scenes, and you kind of feel like you walk into a room and you stumble on something just at the moment when it's happening. But if you'd gone the other way down the hallway, you would have seen other characters doing other things. So you can't be in all the places at once to see it all. The idea was to recapture that feeling in a game. And yet at the same time, it had to be tricked because the game had to work. So to give people the feeling of immersion and the ability to explore, and yet to deliver a story that would be coherent and that would work for everybody, no matter what the player did. And with a large cast of characters who, from their own point of view, were living their own lives and not just waiting around for the player to act on them, but they had their own missions in the story that could be a subplot and that could cross with the player's story in an important way or not. That was kind of the idea of Last Express. And that was challenging and scary in a lot of ways, and I really didn't know if we were going to be able to do it. And for that reason, rather than do that as an in-house project at Broderbund, I thought we had to start a company, hire a team that sort of shared the dream, people who were also who were really ready to take a gamble on something completely unknown and unproven. And so Smoking Car Productions began that way, and I really had no idea what I was getting into, and as it turned out, I bit off a lot more than I could chew. All of the estimates that I had made for how long the game would take and how many people and budget, were way off. I had a great group of collaborators, including Mark Netter, who I'd met in film school, who produced the film shoot, Robert Cook, now Veda Cook, who had he'd been a programmer at Broderbund. He made Gumball and later Degeneration, and then he had done the 2 ports of Karateka. He became the technical director. 2 very talented young programmers. One of them, Mark Moran, went on to become he also went into film, but at the time he was a programming whiz. He was, I think, 17 years old when we started. And we built a team of 30 people, and this project expanded to take 4 years, and all of my savings, all the royalties that I had made from Prince of Persia, all went to fund this game, because and again, some things haven't changed. If you want to keep creative control over your game and you want to take 2 years longer than anybody expected, you kind of have to fund it yourself. Because when publishers pay for a game, then they own it, and they have the right to, if things don't go quite as planned, they have the right to tell you to correct course. So for The Last Express, it nearly killed us, but we made the game. We finished the game, made it the way we wanted to, and it shipped in 1997. and that was it's what the French call a succès d'estime. It was everybody who played it loved it, but there wasn't that many people.
We have only 10 minutes and time for 2 questions. So I would like to ask you about your contacts with cinema. Have you been approached by any famous Hollywood moguls, and they had to consult almost every decision when making Prince of Persia movie? I don't know how many persons this main character can kill or things like that, or just making movie freely?
I'd had the idea, or the dream of making Prince of Persia into a feature film really for a long time. Doug Carlston had even wanted to produce one back in the 90s. But it didn't happen, and then in 2000, the director John McTiernan of Die Hard got interested in it, and we worked together for a couple. I wrote a script, which we took out, and we didn't get funding for that version. Then I had the Prince of Persia. At that time, it was sort of a dead franchise. It was a long time since Prince of Persia 2, and then Prince of Persia 3D, which Broderbund had released in the meantime, had not done very well. But Ubisoft then approached me about making a modern console PlayStation 2 generation reboot, which you may know as The Sands of Time. So we did that project in Montreal, 2002, 2003. It was a great, talented team, many technical and creative innovations in that game, and that kind of put Prince of Persia back on the map. And from the success of the Prince of Persia Sands of Time game, I was able to make a deal with Walt Disney Pictures and Jerry Bruckheimer to do a Prince of Persia movie. But to answer your question about Hollywood big shots, from the moment that Prince of Persia became a Jerry Bruckheimer movie, there was one producer, and that was Jerry Bruckheimer. So, as the guy who had made the game and written the first draft of the screenplay, I was, always welcome on the set. They were kind enough to show me all the versions, along the way. But my opinion didn't really matter. It was, and it was even rare for the first screenwriter, the original screenwriter of a movie, to even be invited anywhere near the set, let alone to be shown rough cuts and given the kind of access I was. I mean, that was a courtesy to me as the game creator. But no, the creative decisions were made by Jerry, including things like casting and hiring the director, and the scale of the production was so huge that you just have to step back and say, okay, this is like a giant circus. I'm just like a tiny little person kind of on the outskirts of this. I'm just going to enjoy the ride. And seeing the Prince of Persia movie now, I have mixed feelings because it's, I love it. I love the universe, and I can see within it it bears such a strong resemblance in many ways to the script that I wrote, but it's not the script that I wrote. There were 5 other writers after me, and so much about it is different that, it's, I don't feel like a proud parent. I feel more like a grandparent or an uncle.
You were always interested in transgression of genres, of mixing mediums and being innovative. But now you are more than comic book screenwriter, more than game creator. So I would like to ask you, what gives you the greatest artistic pleasure at the moment, and tell us about your current projects.
Well, as you'll see if you go to the shop there, my latest project is a graphic novel. It's a modern retelling of The Count of Monte Cristo. It's in French for now. Hopefully there will be English and other language versions later on. But for the last couple of years, I've been, my passion has been writing graphic novels and working with great artists to bring these stories and universes to life. I think I can't choose one medium over the others for all time. I always work on the project that I'm most excited about at that time, and that's sort of always been my approach. I think this, to work in a creative industry is so crazy. Life is too short to spend it working, to take all of the difficulties that we have to deal with in such a profession, and also not be working on something that we love. I'm so grateful that thanks to the success of Prince of Persia and of Karateka before that, I've been able throughout my life to find and create the opportunities to do projects that I was excited about, and to work in all of these different media without having to choose one. So making games, making comics and graphic novels, and writing screenplays for movies, and now also writing books. These are all media that I love, that I've loved since I was a child, and have my love for them has continued to evolve throughout my life. So I'm just very grateful to be able to work in all of them, and I'm happy that I don't have to choose.
It would be all. Jordan will give you 1 hour, I think, for autographs, and he will be in the hallway downstairs. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy Jordanowi.